I'm Dr. Howie Jacobson, and this is the Plant Yourself Podcast. Each week, I bring you a conversation with someone who's making a positive difference in the world. And for my day job, I help leaders and their teams master their mindsets so they can achieve great things. To find out more, check out the Mindset Mastery Memo, my Substack newsletter. You can find it at plantyourself.com/memo. And now, today's show. Dr. Richard Hodge, welcome back to the Plant Yourself Podcast.
Thank you so much, Dr. Howie Jacobson. It's always a pleasure having a conversation with you, good sir.
Likewise. I'm excited for today. We're diving deeper. We had a long conversation before we hit record, which is probably good that we didn't hit record for some of it. But we were talking about the idea of sort of complexity, that we're not talking in sort of sound bites and binaries, and so this is actually the second conversation in what's turning into a sort of series of I think maybe concentric spirals of meaning.
That's a good way of looking at it, yes.
So today I want to dig deeper into, I think, the dragonfly framework, right? And I see, for those of you watching on YouTube, there are dragonflies adorning your background.
I'll just bring my camera backwards instead of forwards, and there they are sitting on the back of my door. And they have a particular meaning for me. I've taken them on very much as a totem, and many in the First Nations peoples around the world will understand totems, because just to pick up on your point of complexity, Howie, there's a deep entanglement, and many First Nations people, they don't just look at those binaries. It's about how they relate to the land, how they relate to their community, how they relate to their ancestors, how they relate to their elders, how they relate to the air, the water, the ancestral stories, the dream time in the Australian Aboriginal. It all is part and parcel of the soul that they carry and the culture that they carry and the way in which they walk with the land and not just on the land. So there's that deep entanglement that largely is missing in the Western view. And I think last week's conversation really was an example of that deep entanglement. So how did we try to get out of or understand something clearer from that deep entanglement as to how we engage in the world? And I've suggested three things that we talked about last week. One, anchor on value, know where you're centered on value, and that we see the world entirely through that framework of value. Doesn't matter who we are, we've all got our own way of perceiving the world that is then our view of that reality. Then that helps us understand what's relevant in that complex world for us to engage in it. And then, depending on how lightly we want to walk on this world, that when we'll think about the consequences. And again, the Aboriginal and First Nations people do that quite extensively, and that's what their elders system is about. But to help them understand all of that complexity, they realise they can't do it themselves. So they carry a totem. They're assigned at birth, and sometimes they'll pick up one or other. And it might be the kangaroo, for example. And then it behoves them, and it's their part of their community responsibility within their community to actually ensure that the world is well set up for the kangaroo, if that's their totem, or for the echidna, or what have you, so that they are part of the landscape and part of the world, and helping understand the world from the kangaroo's perspective, as well as creating a world in which the kangaroo can survive. Well, for me, the dragonfly has become a pretty useful totem. And it's got 7 elements. But more than anything else, it's what it symbolizes. Self-realization. So, self-realize that we're focused on value and that we get to create our own value framework. Transformation, and new beginnings. And if that's what we really want, then it's the shift that we can create in the way in which we anchor on value, how we determine relevance, that'll then create the sorts of consequences from our thinking and action that we want to see in the world. So for me then, that the dragonfly has become a wonderful totem.
Yeah, I love that. And I just want to sort of respond to this idea of sort of embedding ourselves or entangling ourselves in the natural world. So one influence of mine is, I think, Thomas Berry, who, a great writer on sort of the philosophy of life, said he grew up near this pond or this meadow, I think, like this beautiful meadow, and it had a huge impact on him as a child. And he said, what that left him with as he went out into the world is that meadow became his touchstone of value. Like, what I want to do now, does that enhance the resilience and biodiversity of that meadow, or does it threaten it? And that became his touchstone for everything. Do I buy this? Do I go here? Do I write this?
Isn't that a beautiful example? And because it shows that, it doesn't matter the size of the problem. He can find relevance within his own landscape for him to make the world a little bit better. Now, if you multiply that by 8 billion people on this world, now some of us have more opportunity than others to do more, but it's within our grasp to do that, precisely.
Yeah, and go ahead.
No. Oh, well, what I was going to say was just to finish off with or add a little bit more from the dragonfly, because it fits in with the competitive nature. Those who are from the rationalist school and the win type nature. Well, these dear dragonflies are the the apex predator, and the ace predator all around. And when you measure it by their success of killing their prey, capturing and killing their prey, in excess of 90% of success in capturing and killing their prey. And the next most successful predator on the earth, not including people, is the African wild dog or the hyena, and only because they hunt in packs. So, but that's 60% working in packs versus 90% for these brilliant things working alone and, using 80% of their cognitive capacity to sense the world through those huge eyes that they've got. So that whole notion then of how are we sensing the world and determining relevance brings it beautifully into focus.
And that 80% is perceiving the world as it is. As opposed to like our complex human brain that remembers things and overlays memories and expectations on the world, where we might not be seeing much of it at all.
Right.
We might just be seeing our own projection of this looks dangerous or this reminds me of that. And
that's
we
exactly what we are doing. That actually we, who was it who said, we don't see the world, I'm not going to get it right. It's something to the effect of that we don't perceive the world we see the world we perceive. We don't perceive the world we see the world we perceive. So our perception shapes our interpretation of the world.
Well, I mean, you can see that in sort of the Western mind around we're disconnected. I am I'm a solitary being, right? I remember an exercise I did once and looking at a tree and saying like, okay, it's a tree. It's an atomic. It's a unified thing, separate from its environment, and yeah, it interacts. And then the questions were like, where do the roots end and the nutrients begin? Where does the respiration end? Where does the water end? And you realize after just a few seconds that the tree is nothing more than an eddy in a stream. It's a tree-shaped verb that I'm perceiving as a noun
Right.
because of the way I was taught to perceive the world in atomic separation.
Yeah, quite so. But we do that with all sorts of things, and then we complicate it by our own belief systems, the symbolization, the symbology that we give to things. I think it really is then astute for us to come back to having a very clear understanding of what our own value framework is, and that if we want to tackle big problems, then start with that appreciation of your own values, because that will shape you. Change that anchor, and it will change the way in which you perceive the world, not just see the world.
Hmm. Yeah, it's almost like when I became a parent, all of a sudden, like my definition of me grew.
Right.
It's like that little thing there that can't wipe itself is me. Like I need to, all of a sudden I have a greater sense of responsibility, a greater sense of vulnerability to the world and interactivity with the world. And there's no reason it should have stopped with my kids. It could have, it could be my community, my faith community, my Frisbee team, my neighborhood, every living creature on the planet.
Quite
right?
so.
It's my choice where I stop the meanness and extend otherness.
Yeah, I love that turn of phrase because it really just shifts to, it shifts your whole conception of meaning in the world, really. So what is it that you're doing then, as soon as you become a parent? And I know my wife and I, now, we became parents in 1978, so we're going back a fair time. And then again in 1980. But we realized then from our own elders in our family saying, you've got this precious little bundle for such a short time, but it is your way of making the world better more than any other way, because you will instantiate in these humans a value set that will set them for life. And so that when they're no longer yours, as it were, and that they are free legally at 18 in this country to drink, to sign up for the armed forces, so on and so forth, and travel the world all by themselves, you can have confidence that they can go forward in their image, but with a solid foundation of value, and and you work towards that, every little deviation and so on, and the extent to which you learn to let them bring you up as well as you bring them up, and that is really quite a challenge, so that it again, and you don't realize this when you're first a parent, as to the symbiosis in the relationship, as to, yes, you're raising a child, but the child's also raising you. And now I'm delighted to say that I count our two daughters and their husbands as our best friends. And each of them have two children each, and that's our unit of 10. Me, Vicky, and children and grandchildren and their husbands, and that it's gold, right? So now we've gone from me as one to a partnership of two to a small group of 10, and that's made quite a difference, right? So I think that, we matter more than we think, which was one of the points from last week. There's a perfect example of that, and that actually is enough. As I become, now an elder in the family in a big way.
Right, and yet our society, the air we breathe and the water we swim in, tells us that's not where value is created, right? Nobody paid my wife to take care of the children while I was out making a living. No one, right? It's almost like we look around and we look for like signs of worth, and we don't get it from these things. We have to be reminded. We have to hear stories about, I remember Charles Eisenstein talking about Nelson Mandela's grandmother, who stayed home in the little village and sort of raised him, and had an influence greater than kings because of the man she raised. And yet we have to be reminded of that, because our value system, the overt public value system, does not value things that aren't somehow extractive or exploitative or somehow scribbling on the world with big markers.
Yes, but.
Oh, good.
Yes, but. So, because that's one thing, and I think a couple of points around that. First, I notice in the younger generation, my grandchildren's generation, and my youngest grandson will turn 17 next year, and then the eldest will be 24 in a month or two, and we've got 4 grandchildren within that range. They see the world somewhat differently to the way in which we were brought up, that they do want social change, that and a better world, and that they can see that it is indeed possible when, if they can get through the disillusionment. But where I think there is hope in getting through that disillusionment is that others who have been previously disillusioned with those measurement systems, particularly, for example, gross domestic product, it's such a sledgehammer of a measure that ignores all of the things that you're talking about that are so totally valuable in creating, being the creator of kings, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And there's been a lot of work done on a genuine progress indicator, and that ties in a good deal with the modern monetary theory work from the likes of Stephanie Kelton and Mariana Mazzucato, and it's wonderful to see the women in particular, economists, bringing these points of view forward, because within the genuine progress indicator, there is recognition given to parents staying at home raising children, because it's adding value to the social fabric, and it can be counted.
Mm-hmm. Can it be compensated?
It could be, and in some, I don't know for sure, but I wouldn't be surprised if it isn't already being compensated in some of particularly the social democracies around the place. In Europe in particular is where I'm thinking. When you look at extensive maternity and paternity leaves to begin with, and also the generous arrangements around some of their working conditions that enable a far more flexible life that recognizes a much more wholesome good, and people then will be able to do in 4 hours instead of attending for 8. I'm going to say even Bertrand Russell wrote about that 60 or 70 years ago. In Praise of Idleness was his essay, and and spoke to, of how much there were ruling classes who were the idle, and making money off the working classes who were being flogged at anywhere from 10 to 14 hours a day in order to generate the income upon which the idle rich lay. Now, if there's people in America listening to this, I can well imagine some going, yeah, but that's socialism. No, actually, in fact, I was in a bookshop in a seaside town here, and I got on talking with the bookkeeper and the storekeeper, and I commented. I said I thought, as I'm aging, I'm becoming more and more socialist. She says, "Can I suggest another word?" I said, "Certainly." She said, "I think you're becoming humanist." and that fits with where indeed the technology revolutions are going. The industry revolutions is actually going to mass personalization, where this whole issue of, and you can't do that if empathy isn't present. Right? So I think that there is a movement behind the scenes towards this. And so I have hope. I have hope. And I think we can crystallize it, which is where, this sort of thinking aims to offer a perspective that might help people do that.
Great. So, I would love to get into that, because I look at my children in their 20s, and I see them as very well-intentioned carpenters looking to build a better world. And I see you as having tools that can help them do that, based on your understanding of systems, of patterns of history, of the sociology of human interaction. And the dragonfly, we mentioned, it's some of its qualities, but it's also a framework, right? A model. Can we explore?
Absolutely. Now, I'm going to just see if the technology will help me a little here.
Looking good.
There we go. So that's a framework of just 4 groups of what people might think of as, well, ways of framing questions. The sort of why questions that actually help us explore meaning. The how questions that help us understand process and the sort of skills and competencies that we need, but more importantly, how everything is connected, right? So meaning and how is connection. And then, given your understanding of that, then what is the change that you would wish to make? And there's lots of what questions and what explorations that can be done. Now, that's all very conceptual until you come to the if statements that take bits of the what and go, well, if we do that, will it deliver the meaning that we set out to achieve? So quickly we learn then that there's a set of relationships amongst these groups of explorations, right? That why leads you to gaining broader perspectives as to why a particular initiative or why something is problematic that you want to change, how that issue then is connected to the whole. So if you really wanted to have an indigenous-like exploration of the different dimensions of the community, you could do that through the how exploration, and then ideally working with the people, co-create what you would change so that you're not breaking the essence of what is, but actually adding value that you're seeking to drive, and then come back to the if. And so you can see how it sets up a pretty much an infinity loop of how you can go round and round on this various question set. And it really helps us build resilience to resistance that and just to complete the model so that I can then come back to you, here's where those three things we were talking about last week sit.
Can you make it bigger? It's
I can try to do that.
yeah, that's great. Thank you. So just a note for listeners that the YouTube, the video of this conversation includes visuals.
There we go. Yes, the combination of different applications wants to draw it off the screen somewhat, so that I'm unable to shift it from where it is. But unless perhaps if I hold it over like that.
Yeah, it's looking good to me now.
All right, I'll hold it still
Yeah.
there.
Well, dragonflies hover, right?
They do indeed. In fact, they do everything on the wing. But you can see that those explorations from why to how to what to if, and back to see if what you do achieves what you set out to do, and then often you've still got work to do, so you go back into the how and do another loop. It's all anchored on the value. Are you actually delivering the value that you set out to do? And that value helps you realize what is relevant in the world for the change that you're seeking to make. And when you're looking at the what and the how, you're realizing relevance in the sense of becoming aware. You realize that something is important and that it needs to be considered. And then after you've done the work in co-creating that change, you make it real and realize it into the real world if you take certain actions and evaluate it against what you set out to do. But in that, the flip side of value is that whatever you do, whatever you think, will have consequences. It may well influence the wrong people. It may well have catastrophic consequences if all you're seeking to do in your value model is extract gold from a mine, and you don't give a damn about the cyanide poisoning or whatever else that might go on. Now there's rules and regulations around that, but not in every part of the world, and we see quite a lot of ill-founded consequences from that work. So that then gives us the 7 basic elements of the dragonfly, but constantly cycling through those 4 groups of considerations of why, how, what, and if. So does that help give you a bit of the considerations around that? Because from that, each of those elements really help us then focus on some key questions.
So before we go on, I have a question. Something you said that almost passed me by, and then I sort of started chasing after it a little bit and wanted to explore it with you. Is when you said that when we collaborate and we do the what with bringing other people in, we don't break the essence of what is, and that sounds very anti-revolutionary. in terms of revolution, as in down with the old, up with the new. And I'm curious if I'm interpreting that correctly, that you would much prefer evolution to revolution.
Yes, because you cannot predict emergence, right? You cannot predict emergence. So the best we can do as we cycle through this is work out what is our next best step. and then see what happens. And if the action we take has consequences that are consistent with the value in the head of the model, good. Then you can go, well, what if we did a bit more of that? Boom. And depending on who's taking action and the what, you're not going to know the ripple effects through the entangled complexity of today's society, which is a politico-socio-technical mess. And that is a technical term, actually calling it a mess.
What does that mean as a technical term?
Well, that I'm not just being flippant in calling the world a mess. It is that the complex world are full of messy problems, and now David Snowden prefers the word of entanglement, that there is an entanglement in there, and it's worse than a bowl of spaghetti because you can pull it and not necessarily know where the end is or what the ripple effects are of your pulling on any one thread in the world. So therefore, take small steps frequently, and understand as you go through that infinity loop of really understanding why you're seeking to do something, intervene in the world, and that'll be driven by your value model. How the world is connected. So, for example, if you were going to make an intervention into a First Nations community, and you go in there having, engineered a solution in a place, let's say like Canberra, Australia's capital city, which is a long way from outback Australia. And you arrive at a First Nations community and you go, now we've got the answer, here you go, and implement it, and then find it doesn't work. Simply because you haven't thought about how their entire way of working is so different to the Western way of thinking and acting and behaving, and that you have to understand that they're deeply connected to the land. They're deeply connected to ancestors, to dream time, to the story that drives their community, and in fact is the set of stories that is a governing the behaviour in the community. So, and there's a deep entanglement in that. So, and that is true for our world, even though we pretend it's not.
So what does the dragonfly model morph into when we do it the way we do it in the West without humility? It starts with the why, like we want to get something done. What does that look like?
Well, it flips to the what, right? We don't even think about how it's connected to the community. We just go, boom. What do we want? What do we think is the best answer? How then are we going to physically instantiate that? And then, if we do that, how will we test and evaluate to make sure that it meets the requirements that we set out in the first place? So it goes round in a circle rather than in an infinity loop. And my dear old, profession of systems engineering, all you systems engineers out there, you can be guilty as charged, because it is an archetypal rationalist methodology of going, well, why do we need change? Then do some form of requirements analysis that says, well, what are you going to change functionally? Then how are you physically going to do that? And as though the community was a black box. And then how are you going to test and evaluate that to see whether or not you met the requirements that you yourself set. And Tyson Yunkaporta Porter is an Aboriginal researcher, and he's doing up quite a lot of work with Canadian First Nations people as well, looking at indigenous knowledge systems, which is quite fascinating. But he tells a story of how one of his elders, he refers to as Mama Doris, and Mama Doris has experienced this way of Western thought and Western intervention for over 50 years. And she says that the Westerners, they come with good intent, but they get it precisely wrong every time for 50 years because they've done their thinking and they come in and direct a solution. And when it goes wrong, only then do they reflect on what went wrong. And as they work to understand that with community, they learn how the community is connected. And for all of those things that I've talked about before, and then they so deeply understand why that went wrong, then they leave with respect. And she said, if only they would do it in the reverse order. So they typically come in, direct a solution, reflect on why it goes wrong, connect with community, and then leave with respect. Start with respect. Understand how the community is connected, then work with the community to reflect on what change is practical, and direct and create ways of working that almost enable the community to self-direct and not be directed. And then actually that builds respect and adds to the respect, so it gets the infinity loop going. So it really is crucial that we get away from these, I can draw it in a circular pattern, but largely it's linear thinking.
Yeah. So what are some examples that are not sort of like big political issues or social solutions, but sort of could, I'm assuming this is relevant to everyday life, like whether I want to shift my family, have a new job, change, my eating habits, almost anything. Everything's embedded in complex systems. And on my notes for this conversation, you talked about the importance of finding the will to transform. Which almost, we could think of in terms of risk-benefit analysis, but really in terms of emotional courage. So I'm wondering if we can bring this to the issues that listeners and myself face on a day-to-day basis, even if we're not overtly saying, I want to change the world.
Well, you start with yourself, even if you do want to change the world. But, and how you do anything is one thing, is how you do everything is, some of the other aphorisms around. But if you want to change eating habits, for example, well, then you can, what's changed in your value proposition, in your framework of value, that's forced you to think about that.
All right, so I've just gotten a diagnosis.
Right.
Someone I know just had a heart attack. I saw a documentary about factory farming.
Yes.
I got ready for beach season and I looked in the mirror. Right.
And these are the very real things. And but that then enables you to create a shift that you're now putting more value, for example, on your health. Mm-hmm. And for whatever reason, you've been, spending a lot of time, as I did when I was younger, chasing the company goals. And it took me 30 years to realize that the companies wouldn't love me back. So there was a shift in my value proposition that forced me then to look more inwardly about, my own value and how I wanted to maintain a healthy mind, body, and soul. So I think that each of us do that first in looking at what's shifted in our own way in which we're looking at the world and interacting with it through our value framework. Then that gives you the first bit in the why. So why now do you want to focus on, the health and or eating habits? And because you've noticed that perhaps you're not exercising as much. I'm talking more about me, that I'm not exercising as much as I used to. And one of the things that I'm seeking to reduce is my caffeine input. Why? Again, and you mention it, a mate of mine who was only 2 years older than me, and he appeared fit as a fiddle, died of a heart attack 1 week after his 70th birthday. And you go, crikey. So therefore that gives the meaning as to what is the shift that I want to then focus on in reducing my caffeine input, being more conscious of how I fuel my body in order and exercise it. Now, how do I want to do that in a way that isn't going to disrupt the things that are absolutely important to me? And when I look at how everything is connected, I'm driven by three main priorities in my life. One, my relationship with my wife. I say not my wife, my relationship with my wife. Two, my relationship with my children and my grandchildren. And three, my relationship with my work. Now, is anything I'm going to do about that going to interfere with those relationships? Well, certainly in terms of how we plan family meals, then there's going to be some conversations had and done in a way that doesn't, that actually adds value to that relationship around that. And then I can talk with Vicky, since it's mostly just her and I living at home these days, and say, well, look, what's our menu plan going to be for the week? And we co-create that. I'm not imposing on her, a life of celery and sparkling water, because you only want to cook one meal, not two. And then if we make those changes in our life, then we will get some feedback as we evaluate that. And lo and behold, here the technology comes in. And earlier last week, I got a little message on my little Apple Watch going, oh, there's been a change in your health status. Oh, shit, it doesn't tell you exactly what immediately. But I find that my basic heart rate had been lowered by 8 points over the last 4 weeks. And I go, there's a bit of feedback. So there is one loop of that and it's had consequences. Now, is that going to add to my life or whatever? I don't know, but the consequences are that I feel healthier, and it's added to and reinforced that shift in my value framework.
And I love the humility that's just inherent in taking things iteratively, looking at where are the chances for unintended consequences, right? Because most of the conversations about caffeine or celery aren't about caffeine or celery, right?
No.
They're about who am I? Who are you? Am I all of a sudden better than you? Are we still going to sit together in the morning? Or, right? Like, so there, to be open to kind of the layers of meaning, which I think is where you said, how can we enhance the relationship rather than like, okay, I've got, I've invested in the relationship so that I can make a withdrawal to make things slightly worse, right? As opposed to how can this conversation how can, right, the higher level value of this relationship be enhanced, even as I want to enhance it through maybe living longer and better.
That's right. And that we're really, the complexity mostly is born by people, right? That we are, each of us having several different roles in life, and that sometimes those roles rub up against each other as we live together, or that we work together, or that we do both. And in my wife and I's case, we're both directors of our company, and so we live, work, and play together in everything. So that relationship is absolutely vital. But I think that's vital for everyone to look at complexity through that human lens, and then ask less. In fact, it was just at the last systems engineering conference in Dublin in July, or at the beginning of this month. Professor Catherine Cormican talked about Industry 5.0 and how that, whereas Industry 4.0 was all about automation, heavy technology focus and all of that, Industry 5.0 is more about mass personalization and that bringing the human and the robotics elements in harmony, and the need for empathy. But she turned things on their head, whereas previously we would look at technology and then how that then shifted into products that enabled experiences and from which we drew meaning. Well, actually, we need to turn that on its head and go, but what is the meaning that we're seeking to shift and find or create? What's the experiences that enable that? Then the products that will be useful in that experience, that'll then dictate what technologies need to be developed. And so it neatly turns it on its head, and then fits with the model that we've just been talking about in terms of why. That you start with why. That's the meaning piece, and then how it connects into our experience base, some of which we actually want to retain because, life's beautiful and there's still a lot of truth and goodness in it. Co-create the what that might be some form of product or technology, and then if that is applied as a whole, whether or not that actually delivers the meaning that we had hoped for in the first place.
What's just
a nice inversion.
Yeah, what that reminds me of, I don't know. Do you ever watch Rory Sutherland's TED Talk?
I haven't. No.
So he's a British marketing guy, and he was talking about so marketing has reached sort of the end of its rope in terms of more things. Everyone needs more things to be happy. We have too many things. So for most people who are not in the poverty end of the spectrum, and he uses the example of how the UK and France spent $20 billion to make the Channel Tunnel faster.
Right. Because
the journey was 6 hours. This is $20 billion took this many years. It took it says. So what was the problem was it wasn't fast enough. So that's the problem they tried to solve. He says the problem was people weren't enjoying the journey. He said for $20 billion, if you had supermodels serving champagne, right?
It reminds me actually of a similar, the foible of humanities, of us humans, that in many high-rise apartments, lifts never arrive fast enough, right? And it's because people weren't enjoying their time waiting for the lift, so they put more mirrors in, right? And in the hotels, then the more mirrors they put in, the less people complained, right? And because you can go, all right, yeah, I'm getting ready. Am I? Yeah, I think I'm ready to actually go downstairs and meet the boss, and boom, bingo. the complaints dropped off. And you're exactly right with regard to the channel experience of people just weren't enjoying the journey. Yeah, yeah, yeah. There you go.
So you talked about the will to transform, right?
Yeah.
That from one side of the journey, the infinity loop, it looks like it's scary, right? So that and even it might be it might not be. We might end up much better off than we are now. But there are certain things we have to sacrifice, right, or perceive to have to sacrifice in order to get on that infinity loop. And I wonder if you could talk about that.
Well, I'll come back. There's a couple of things I think I'd like to say, and it's a perfect question, Howie. That as people are looking at this model of the why, if, what, and how, they are coloured differently. That the what and the how relate very much to the concepts that we hold. They're conceptual. We are aware that change is necessary. We can become aware of what change will be relevant. But until we go from awareness of change to actually the other form of realizing relevance, and that is making that not only relevant but real in the world, then what we end up with is almost like a great void between the conceptual and the doing. And that's often known as the knowing-doing gap. And it's a well-known thing. There's a recent article last year in Harvard Business Review, and I'll dig it out for you. I can't remember the exact title right now, but it goes to the point that there could be all sorts of reasons why people, even though they're aware that the change is good, are fearful of making any change. Or certain people seeing a lot of humanity in the world, but are fearful of saying anything about it, of popping their head up over the precipice. Sorry, I've just got that
All right,
spot in the back of my throat.
take care of yourself. Well, this is all editable.
Goodo. So it's that knowing-doing gap, and it's often driven by fear. Excuse me, which is particularly born if there's just you and me thinking that this is a good idea, right? And that maybe we have sequestered ourselves away and we've gone, all right, now. And we know it's bloody good, but how are we actually going to take that to anywhere else? Well, the thing is how then do you build a coalition of the willing? And even doing that is, so can you test it with friends who might say, no, look, the climate's not right for that yet, or that technically I can see this problem, or socially I can see this problem in your stepping forward. And the more of those sorts of conversations you can have, and then not present the solution, but rather shift the conversation back to the why. Why is the current situation problematic? And how do we want our way of living together improved without destroying what is working and good right now? And when you can have those conversations, then they will help create the what. and that helps close the knowing-doing gap. And it's more art than science.
Boy, this reminds me so much of a process that I'll use as a coach when I'm working with someone who has something they want to accomplish, and then they exhibit what we will call resistance.
Yes.
Right. And as a coach, I was trained to kind of help them blast through the resistance. And as someone who's approaching elderhood, I've discovered that the thing to do is to put the resistance in the Y square.
Yeah.
And say, okay, rather than, okay, so we want it to change because, you weren't happy with this. Now, okay, but I'm not making the change. I'm still going out for junk food. I'm resistant. And so now we look at, great, let's take the why, what's going on, instead of calling it resistance, like what's the knowing that this change is untenable or will lead to greater suffering. And it's such a much more respectful way of dealing with people rather than just calling something a pathology or an obstacle and wanting to blast it away.
So it does pay. And it's like coming back to the indigenous example, of entering it with respect, and that means giving that person respect, because there's probably good reason in their mind as to why they are not on the same plane as you for that particular issue, and often people love talking about the problems. They also like talking about their aspirations. And that's where the respect and really understanding grounds for common shared meaning, and when that happens, then you can come back to the how and say, but this isn't going to affect the relationship between you and your boss. If anything, it's actually going to strengthen it if there's a good reason for that, and you can begin to look at the things that are actual currencies for them beyond money, time, happiness, and status. Those it's worth exploring all four of those currencies and seeing just what might shift, and then it's not so scary. I go, well, actually, if we went with this, I stand a chance of improving my status in the executive's eyes, and that would do my aspirations for becoming an executive, so much the better. And it's just about finding those currencies without disrupting too much, holding respect for people and for their connection with the family, with the business, with other relationships, and then co-creating the what's actually. But typically we want to drive straight to solution and not deal with this other stuff that is much softer but yet goes to the limbic brain.
Well, I mean, what I was thinking of is when you were talking about the knowing-doing gap being sort of fear as an element of it. I see a lot where fear leads to the need for drastic solutions, right? Like, things are so, like, the example of someone who gets told by their doctor, if you don't change tomorrow, your heart's going to, okay, so there's a good reason to do a total shift. For most people, most of the time, or
yes.
for the society at large, the feeling, like I sort of feel revolutionary a lot. Like, let's just tear this whole pile of shit down and build something new. And I can recognize now that it really is fear driven. That it really is like, things are so urgent, things are so bad, or I don't, I want to make a living as a trainer, consultant, coach, but the companies that would pay me the money that I want, I don't want to work for them because they're, eating the earth, and it all becomes very paralyzing. The fear makes me want to either not do anything or do something so drastic that it will have no effect whatsoever.
Well, I think it comes back to patience, being prepared to have that long journey through the tunnel, as long as you're enjoying the process of seeing and getting a sense of progress. There was a thought leader, a good friend of mine, Dr. Jason Fox, who wrote a book, How to Lead a Quest. And he talks a lot about progress and the importance of progress, and saying that even, getting a sense of progress is invaluable to making progress. So that, and that almost goes back to, the earlier part in our conversation when we were talking about the genuine progress indicator, and the value of, mothers by choice or circumstance staying at home to look after their children, and that feeling that society doesn't value that as an occupation at all, when indeed it is the potential to actually improve the world one human at a time or one family at a time. And that when it's looked at from a different currency, then progress is quite visible.
So patience takes faith, right? And I'm hearing that progress bits, glimmers maybe, is what can replenish
I
the
love
faith.
that idea of glimmers. And that you get a glimmer of that people start using different words, or they start talking and picking up some of the vocabulary that you're using, because you talk about how to get a shift and using the language of that, and then when you find, no matter, because sometimes I've said, well, look, I've tried to explain this change and I've sort of run out of words. Let me see if I can try and explain it differently. And then you try that different set of words, and then you go, oh, right, okay. But within, I don't know, a period of time, and I was thinking in that particular example of a large strategic planning transformation that I was leading, actually had people coming back after a month or so using language to justify using language I had used to justify the position they now wanted to take. And you go, there's a glimmer that we're actually getting a shift, and then it begins to, like the snowball effect, and that it does start to slowly build from that. But if you think about viral change, it's all, anything exponential, it's gradual, suddenly, bang, you've got change.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, what came up for me there is sort of the resistance to the gradual. I've seen it so many times because it seems like the gradual is not real, and it's getting in the way of the whole. So for example, I've been part of sort of the plant-based and vegan movement. I went to a conference and a guy was talking about how stupid meatless Mondays are because it's 1/21st of your or 1/7 of your life, and look at climate change and look at cow fart emissions, and it's just a waste of time. And then, when back in 2016, I was a Bernie guy and felt so betrayed by the Democratic Party for not nominating Bernie. And it was very hard for me to appreciate that Bernie had really influenced the platform around so many things, around the value of labor, around.
He continues to do so, and so many of the younger generation are listening.
Okay, and another example is a friend of mine who's been on the podcast, Micah Hendler, founded the Jerusalem Youth Choir, which is Jews and Muslims, Israelis, Palestinians singing together. And it's beautiful, and particularly in the parts of the Palestinian community, it feels like collaboration or giving a pink washing or peace washing the struggle. and I totally can kind of understand both points of view. And there's on days when I'm afraid, when that's sort of the dominant emotion, it seems like, love is not the answer. And then on other days, I'm like, love is the only answer.
Love is the only answer. But I think there's a faith movement around that. Or if you've spoken with Christopher Miller, then you'll be into the joy of finding fish, fulfillment, inspiration, success, and happiness. And Christopher's message is very strongly centered on love is the only answer. But, so too was John Lennon. And that's not to take anything away from what Christopher's saying either. But I think that comes back to what anchors you, and if love is a very strong noun and verb in the way in which you set your value proposition, then you're going to live with it, and with love comes patience, right? Because go back to the little baby. You've got to be 18 years before that's a registered adult, legal to inherit the earth, as it were, and go forth. So it is a patient game, but it's also a game of constant reinforcement, right? The sun comes up every day, boom, and gives us energy. And we've got to get up every day and give what we believe in energy that it needs.
Well, I'm ready for a mic drop right there. Is there something more that you want to add to this conversation that I haven't yet elicited?
No, look, I think maybe the last word goes back to the dragonfly, and that they do absolutely everything on the wing, from hunting to mating to eating, and so this whole idea you often hear in corporates of we're building the plane while we're flying it. Well, actually, dragonflies are doing that all the time. But here's the thing. Dragonflies spend 80% of their life as a nymph in water, which means that at some point in time they've got to leave the comfort of what they know and climb out on a stick and hang on, and then be patient while transformation takes place, and they have their wings and then can fly and be the dragonfly. So I think that there is a metaphor there for each and every one of us that feels somewhat disillusioned. Well, are you hanging on to the comfort of your current environment, or is there something that you really want to hang on to and have the will to change and shift? Then you need to give that time for you to find the words, the thinking, and the action that'll then drive you to transform from nymph as you are to dragonfly as your possibility.
I love it. I love it. One of the things I have to do after each of these conversations is come up with a title, and the title keeps growing. It's got all these words: love, patience, transformation, dragonfly. So it's already too many letters for YouTube. So I'll have to focus on something in particular. But Richard, thank you so much for.
It's been a joy, Howie.
And we're gonna I think continue this, right? If you're willing, with different models and the how, if, why, then, why, what framework.
That's certainly something that we haven't touched on that is possible. That around that why, what, how, if you can indeed create some very simple models on one sheet of paper that enable you to guide a conversation through that.
Ooh, well, if you're willing to share trade secrets, I'm all ears.
All right, but we'll have to get the technology working for sure so that I can properly share this screen.
Excellent.
Excellent.
All right. Take care, Richard. Thank you so much.
Cheers, Howie.